The frost crept over the Ardennes forest in early December 1944, coating tree branches and muddy tracks with an icy grip. In a small training camp deep in Belgium, Lieutenant Crazy Karl Hoffmann was being laughed at by his peers. They mocked him for his unconventional tank maneuvers, the reckless angles he took, the daring reversals during drills, and the impossible risks he seemed eager to test. Yet behind the teasing laughter, a spark of intuition burned. Karl was not reckless by accident. He understood the heartbeat of a tank, the way steel responded to terrain, and how fear could be weaponized as much as ammunition. The rumors of his upcoming deployment spread, and even the instructors who had once doubted him felt a strange tension. Here was a soldier who could either be a disaster or a legend. By the 15th of December, Karl's unit was on the move, rumbling toward the Ardennes, snow crunching under tracks and boots, the forest closing in like a frozen cathedral. Intelligence had warned of German panzer divisions lying in ambush, but Karl's mind was alive with strategy, imagination, and a strange thrill at the prospect of chaos. As they advanced, the air was thick with frost, smoke from distant artillery, and the metallic tension of men who knew that death lurked in every shadow, every bend of the road. When the first German tank appeared on a ridge ahead, the conventional response was hesitation. Karl's crew froze for a fraction, but their commander's eyes met Karl's, and he knew instinctively what was coming. In a move that would shock both allies and enemies, Karl threw the tank into reverse, backing down the slope with precision, using the terrain to funnel the enemy into a choke point. Shells splintered trees and ricocheted off earth embankments, but Karl's tank moved as if alive, dodging, twisting, and exploiting angles that textbooks had never taught. The duel became a symphony of steel and fire. Every shot fired, every ricochet was a note in a chaotic score. The crew's hearts hammered in synchrony with the thundering gunfire, adrenaline sharpening reflexes that no drill could teach. Each calculated retreat was actually an attack in disguise. Karl had engineered the battlefield from behind his turret, forcing the enemy into lines of fire that maximized his tank's strength. The forest seemed alive with the roar of engines, the smell of burning fuel, and the cries of soldiers as the impossible unfolded. Men on the ridge, watching, couldn't believe the tank reversing away from them was orchestrating the very trap that would claim their armor. Hours passed as Karl executed maneuver after maneuver, turning confusion into strategy, chaos into survival. By nightfall, snow had turned red in patches, and the forest echoed with the hollow groan of destroyed tanks. Allied forces who had initially observed Karl's madness were now stunned into silence. He had used the enemy's own expectations against them, transforming what seemed like a desperate flight into a decisive offensive. News of the stunt spread through radio chatter and field dispatches. Tank reversed into battle, destroyed multiple panzer units, crew unharmed. Soldiers whispered in mess halls and officers wrote frantic notes, trying to capture the logic of the maneuver. Historians would later puzzle over the duel, arguing over the tactical genius versus raw instinct, but at that moment, the men who had survived knew only one thing: they were alive because Karl had been willing to risk everything that normality demanded. When the dust settled, Karl's crew climbed down from their battered tank, shaking and exhilarated. The cold had become a companion to fear. The trees stood like silent witnesses to carnage, and the snow glimmered in moonlight over mangled steel. Every shell dent, every scratch, every burned patch on the tank told a story of split-second decision-making and courage under fire. Karl, calm but intensely aware, walked among his men, noting fatigue etched into faces and soot lining every uniform. The forest was eerily quiet, as if paying respect to a moment where instinct and daring had triumphed over overwhelming odds. Each survivor carried more than relief. They carried the memory of a duel that would be whispered in barracks and mess halls for decades. They had witnessed the extraordinary, a tank reversing into the jaws of death and emerging victorious. And yet the forest held ghosts, the fallen enemy, the near misses, the whispered questions of how long this victory could last. In the aftermath, as reinforcements arrived, Karl's reputation became legend. Maps were redrawn in command rooms to highlight his maneuvers, and generals debated sending him on riskier assignments, wary of both the danger and the potential genius he represented. His crew, once skeptical, now spoke of him with awe, recounting every twist, every calculated reversal, every shot fired with surgical precision. The Ardennes winter pressed on, cold and relentless, but the legend of the tank driver who dared to reverse into battle spread across lines of communication. Journalists and later historians would call it the war's wildest duel, a case study in risk, intuition, and courage. For Karl, it was another day of survival in a conflict that demanded both insanity and genius. His story would later inspire future generations of armored warfare specialists, proving that even the most unconventional tactics, when executed with precision and nerve, could rewrite the rules of engagement. The forest returned to silence, the snow hiding the scars of battle, yet every soldier carried the memory of what had transpired. Karl looked at his tank one last time, seeing not just steel and tracks, but a testament to audacity, daring, and the blurred line between madness and brilliance. His crew followed, leaving tracks in the snow, whispers of awe trailing behind them. The Ardennes had tested men, machines, and strategy, and in this crucible, one tank driver had turned a reversal into legend. The story of Crazy Karl was far from over, and as dawn approached, it promised more battles, more duels, and more moments where courage and instinct could defy death. The Ardennes forest had become a frozen trap by December 16, 1944. Snow-muffled footsteps, smoke rose from distant artillery, and the ever-present tension pressed down on every soldier and tank. Karl Hoffmann's tank, nicknamed Silver Fang by his crew for its sleek lines and relentless resilience, creaked through the frost-laden underbrush. The air smelled of fuel, gunpowder, and fear, a scent that clung to skin and clothing like a second layer. Intelligence reports had been grim. A German panzer brigade was moving swiftly through the narrow valley ahead. Allies whispered warnings of ambushes, hidden anti-tank guns, and seasoned enemy crews ready to obliterate anyone foolish enough to advance without caution. Karl, however, thrived on these whispers. Every soldier's heartbeat echoed in the cold steel of his tank, sinking to the rhythmic pounding of tracks over frozen mud. His crew had long learned that hesitation meant death. Orders were secondary to instinct, and today instinct would be tested against one of the most brutal armored formations of the war. Trees splintered, snow exploded into clouds of ice and debris, and the tank's turret rattled as shells grazed its side. Karl gritted his teeth, eyes scanning the tree line for movement, anticipating angles that would catch the enemy by surprise. Without hesitation, he reversed, backward into the valley, using the tank's mass to funnel the enemy into a premeditated trap. Each inch of retreat was deliberate. Every shake of the suspension, every groan of the treads over rock and ice was a note in a symphony of destruction. The Germans, thinking his tank was fleeing, advanced aggressively, only to be funneled into crossfire, laid out by Karl's uncanny understanding of terrain and timing. Machine guns spat fire from concealed positions. Explosions turned snow into clouds of red and white, the forest echoing with a terrifying mix of human screams, metal grinding on metal, and the hiss of molten armor. One German Panther tank, a behemoth in steel, attempted to flank Karl's position. His crew held their breaths as the enemy closed in. With a sudden lunge, Karl pivoted the turret while still moving backward, tracking the Panther's movement with razor-sharp precision. The shot fired, echoing like a cannon through the forest, striking the Panther's side armor. Sparks flew, tracks buckled, the enemy tank stalled, helpless in a trap only a few could have anticipated. Behind the turret, Karl's crew erupted with controlled relief, but there was no time to celebrate. More panzers appeared, hiding behind trees, using shadows as shields, forcing Karl into a deadly dance of retreat, ambush, and counterattack. Every second mattered. One miscalculation, one slight misfire, and Silver Fang would join the wrecks, littering the snowy valley. Hours dragged on. Snow fell steadily, coating destroyed tanks and broken limbs alike, a chilling blanket over chaos. Karl executed move after move, each more daring than the last. exploiting slopes, tree cover, and frozen embankments. Allied artillery fired from distant positions, and German reinforcements were funneled by the forest into Karl's carefully improvised kill zones. The crew's hands were raw from controls, knuckles white, eyes flicking from periscope to instrument panel to enemy movement. Sweat froze on their brows even as the cold tried to sap their strength. At one point, Karl ordered a near-impossible reverse up a narrow incline while simultaneously firing at two advancing Tigers. The recoil shook the tank violently, metal groaning under stress, yet every shot found its mark, the forest erupting in smoke and fire. Soldiers on the ground ducked instinctively, knowing survival depended on distance, cover, and the unseen genius guiding Silverfang from within. By dusk, the forest was a chaotic graveyard of twisted steel, smoke, and the echoes of the fallen. Karl paused briefly, surveying the battlefield. Trees had been shattered, tanks disabled, and the snow was stained with streaks of red. For a fleeting moment, silence returned, broken only by the hiss of coolant, escaping damaged tanks, and the groan of wounded men. The crew, exhausted but alive, shared a glance that spoke more than words ever could. They had survived the impossible. Karl stepped from the turret, surveying the frozen carnage, the weight of command pressing heavily on his shoulders. Every life spared, every shell fired, had been a calculation of instinct, timing, and unyielding courage. Yet even in victory, the spectre of loss hung heavy. The enemy had fought with equal desperation, and the Ardennes had claimed many silent witnesses to the war's cruel impartiality. Night fell, turning the forest into a shadowed cathedral of destruction. Fires burned in patches, illuminating twisted metal and frozen faces. Karl's tank, battered but intact, was now a symbol of audacity and survival. Orders came to regroup and report back, but the memory of the duel lingered in every man's mind. It was not just the destruction wrought or the tactical brilliance displayed, but the realization that war demanded both genius and madness in equal measure. Historians would later call it one of the most extraordinary armored duels of WWII, a battle that could not be taught, only witnessed. For Karl and his crew, it was a baptism by fire, proof that courage, instinct, and a willingness to embrace chaos could turn a desperate situation into a legend that would echo long after the forest had returned to silence. By the following morning, reports of Karl's feat spread through radio channels and command centers. Generals debated the audacity and risks, journalists chronicled the tank reversing into battle story with awe, and the crew became an unlikely source of inspiration for armored units across Europe. The Ardennes duel became more than a battle. It was a lesson in psychological warfare, risk, and the power of instinct. Karl's actions, once ridiculed in training camps, now defined the boundary between madness and military genius. In the frozen forest among the wrecks and smoke, one tank driver had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that the edge between life and death could be mastered not by fear, but by courage, intuition, and sheer audacity. The forest was quiet now, but that quiet carried the weight of death. Smoke lingered like a stubborn fog, twisting around shattered trees and frozen craters. Karl's tank, Silverfang, sat amid the wreckage, battered but unbeaten, its tracks scarred into the snow like the footprints of a beast that had walked through fire and emerged alive. Inside, the crew moved with a hollow kind of exhaustion. Every face told the same story, relief tinged with disbelief, a quiet mourning for those who had fallen, and a heavy, unspoken recognition that they had danced with death and survived. The Ardennes had tested every instinct, every nerve, and every ounce of courage they possessed. For hours, Karl had guided them through a forest that had become a trap, a cathedral of destruction, and yet here they were, standing amid the ruins, their tank a lone monument of survival in a frozen hellscape. Reinforcements finally arrived, their headlights cutting through the dim haze, illuminating twisted steel and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Karl's orders were crisp but weary: regroup, secure positions, and prepare for the next movement. No one celebrated. There was no joy in victory here, only the grim understanding that survival was a momentary reprieve, not a promise. Each soldier carried the memory of the duel, the roar of engines, the whistle of shells, the sudden silence after each strike. The crew recounted every maneuver, every risk, and every shot that had defied odds. It was a story that seemed impossible in its audacity, yet undeniably true. News would eventually spread of the tank reversing into battle, an act that borders on legend, but for those who had lived it, the moment was raw, visceral, and far from glamorous. Karl had not sought fame. He had sought survival for his crew and a chance to turn the tide of the skirmish. As night gave way to dawn, Karl walked the perimeter of the battlefield. Snow still fell, lightly at first, then heavier, covering tracks and hiding the scars of war beneath a deceptive blanket of white. Everywhere he looked, the remnants of the duel were evident: twisted armor, shattered helmets, and the frozen forms of those who had not survived. The scene was eerily beautiful in its stillness, yet haunting in its human cost. He knelt beside one of the panther wrecks, noting the precision that had brought it down, the calculated risk that had saved his crew, and the narrow margins between life and death. Karl's mind replayed the duel over and over, not in pride, but in a relentless analysis of choices and consequences. Every movement, every decision had been magnified by danger, and yet each had been necessary. It was a battle that could not be fully understood from reports or photographs. It had to be lived. Back at the command post, radio transmissions crackled with the accounts of other units. Stories of Karl's maneuver reached commanders, analysts, and historians alike. They marveled at the audacity, debating whether it was genius or madness, but those who had seen it firsthand knew it was both. Soldiers discussed it in hushed tones, their respect tinged with disbelief. The Silver Fang had become more than a tank. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when instinct and courage converged. Yet Karl remained grounded. His thoughts lingered on the men who would never see another sunrise, the soldiers who had fought valiantly but were swallowed by the forest. The Ardennes duel had left its mark not only on the enemy, but on every soul present, imprinting memories that would linger long after the war's end. Weeks later, as the Allies advanced and the forest slowly returned to its natural rhythm, Karl reflected on the duel. He understood the fragile nature of survival, the thin line between life and death, and the unexpected ways in which courage manifests. The war was far from over, but that moment, the tank reversing into battle, defying expectation, turning panic into precision, would remain etched in history. It was not the glory of victory nor the destruction of the enemy alone that defined it, but the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. Karl's crew, scarred but unbroken, carried on, each day a testament to their endurance, ingenuity, and unwavering loyalty to one another. The Ardennes had tested them in ways that could never be taught, forging a bond deeper than any drill or order could instill. Years later, historians would study the battle, military academies would dissect every maneuver, and war enthusiasts would retell the story of the crazy tank driver who reversed into death and rewrote the rules of armored warfare. Yet for Karl, the memory was not about accolades or instruction. It was about the lives intertwined with his, the terror faced and survived, and the unspoken understanding that even in chaos, humans could create order. Even in the shadow of death, courage could prevail. He would remember the roar of engines, the hiss of shells, the smell of burnt metal and snow, the fleeting expressions of fear and determination on the faces of friend and foe alike. Those moments, seared into memory, were reminders that history is not just dates and strategies, but the human experience, raw, terrifying, and magnificent all at once. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the Ardennes, Karl stood once more beside Silver Fang. The forest was silent, save for the whisper of wind through the trees. The battle was over, but its echoes would remain forever in the snow, in the scars of the tanks and in the hearts of those who had survived. He understood the lessons the duel had taught him. Courage often masquerades as recklessness, instinct can outmatch planning, and even in the darkest hours, humanity can assert itself in acts of daring and ingenuity. The Ardennes had been both a graveyard and a proving ground, and Carl had emerged as a witness, a participant, and ultimately a survivor whose story would inspire generations. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.